Today, I want to talk about eating. Even more specifically, that situation in which you know you don't have a full eating disorder, but you still do realize you're having some hard time, some difficulties. That situation in which you find yourself on the edge, trying to balance your life, knowing that you could easily enter within that sphere of an eating disorder, but at the same time, not so much. Not everybody finds themselves to have to tackle bulimia, anorexia, or obesity. But what I also don't think is enough spoken about is that common ground in which, at least once in our lives, we have found ourselves in. And what I'm referring to is that situation in your life where you know you're not suffering from a full eating disorder, but at the same time, you might begin to experience some type of crisis, which might eventually even lead to an eating disorder. We should all be aware that eating disorders are a part of a very vast spectrum. And I believe that the ends of this very spectrum aren't enough spoken about, aren't given enough attention. Imagine a line from point A to point B. In the middle of this line, we have all the eating disorder diagnoses known to humanity. Whereas on the other two ends of this line, we have some gray areas. I'm referring to those gray areas. Almost all the people that I've met in my life, at least once in their lives, they have experienced a moment of uncertainty in which they would double down in their workout schedules or go on weird diets. Even though these moments of uncertainty aren't fully considered as eating disorders, at least in that stage, I do believe they could lead to one. And I myself, throughout my entire life, found myself right in the middle of this situation, that gray area, where I didn't know how to call it, because it wasn't a full eating disorder, but it also was a very uncomfortable period of my life. Now, does that mean I have an eating disorder? Does that mean I had an eating disorder? I don't think so, but I can certainly tell you that once that hamster wheel starts spinning in your head, it's very difficult to make it stop. Ever since I began more or less middle school, my parents weren't very forgiving with the way I looked. And by that, I don't mean it came from a bad place, but it certainly didn't do any good. I definitely went through some periods in my life where I was for sure overweight, and my parents wouldn't hesitate to let me know that they would notice that I was, overweight. And as much as that might seem usual to some people, given the relationship that you might have with your parents, for me, it was completely not okay. I was a very sensitive kid. And I still am to this day, but back then, it was completely out of control. The effect that it had on me is that I became very self-conscious, to the point where I was very uncomfortable within my own skin. And the problem was that I couldn't actually talk about it with anyone because I felt like there were other people out there who were having a harder time than I was. Therefore, why should I whine about my situation where I'm clearly not as much as in trouble as other people might be? But what it also did is it sparked some curiosity in me, because I wanted to know what would the actual good-looking body type be to make me feel normal and also stop my parents' comments, for example. And that's the exact moment in my life where I started experiencing this hamster wheel turning in my head, and it hasn't stopped ever since. So the first thing I did was I went online. That was the number one mistake. Never go online for medical things or for these things in general. Because as soon as I typed in, I think it was the ideal body type or something like that, I realized that all the images I saw were bodies that did not look like mine. So even though I heard other people telling me, it's okay, it's normal, every shape should be celebrated, which I still believe to this day, but back then I was like, no one looks like me in those pictures, so I definitely should be in the wrong lane. Long story short, my research wasn't very helpful, nor was it that long, because, again, I saw bodies that didn't look like mine, and I had no idea that that was just a common ideology of what a good body type might be. And as much as I hate saying this, it is kind of normal, unfortunately, because in nowadays society, we're all worried of other people's perception, right? The norm would be to have that really good looking body type that I saw online. So therefore, I must have been doing something wrong and I wasn't normal, right? Wrong. In my case, I constantly feel like I will never be able to set a good relationship with food. And the reason I say that is not because I'm an actual pessimistic person, even though I also am, but also because I tend to fail to see the bigger picture most of the time. Some of us might know that our mental health is directly connected to our stomach. Some people also might say that our stomach is our second brain because we have this very interesting explanation behind it that says that if something is wrong in your mental health, if something is bothering you, it will most likely have some effect on your digestive system. And that is what most people fail to see. Most people think that these two are very separate issues, whereas they're not. If there's something bothering you in your mental health, if there's something that's worrying you, or if you're scared about something and it lingers in your head for such a long time, it will eventually travel to your physical existence, therefore your stomach in this case, your digestive system. So the way you eat or do not eat in some cases will affect also your physical well-being, and you will most likely begin to feel extremely uncomfortable within your own skin. What that tends to create also, unfortunately, is a toxic trait, a loop, where it starts with your mental health, it then becomes into your physical existence, then you don't like what you see, and therefore you feed yourself extremely negative thoughts that obviously linger in your head, in your mental health. So it's a constant ping-pong ball going back and forth between your mental health and your physical health. And it's extremely difficult to stop this toxic cycle. Another thing I've noticed is that most people don't get it. Most people don't understand this type of discomfort, of struggle. Even though they might be in it, it might also be because the way they experience it might be slightly different from the way you describe your version of the experience, so they don't relate to it. And to what I'm referring to, again, is not the actual eating disorder itself, but it's those gray areas in which you know you're not suffering from a actual food disorder, but you are experiencing a very difficult relationship with food, and you're afraid that it will push you into that sphere of an actual eating disorder. So I think that there are two main reasons why people sometimes fail to relate to what you're trying to explain. Number one is they actually suffer from a full-on eating disorder, the type of struggle that might require some professional type of help to get better. And in this case, it kind of makes you feel guilty in a way because you're not supposed to be whining about an issue that isn't as bad as this other person's issue. But that works until a certain extent, because I believe that everybody's mental and physical health matters, and it's not a competition. The second reason is the complete opposite. They never experienced any type of food insecurity nor any type of disorder. Healthy people do exist, thanks God, but I just don't think that they have been healthy throughout their entire lives 24/7. The point that I'm trying to make is that regardless you suffer from an eating disorder or you don't, we all at least once in our lives have found ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation. That unstable feeling when you go up to a mirror, you look at yourself and you don't really like what you see. To some people, that might be the color of your eyes. To others, that might be your weight. But what I do think that both people with an eating disorder and people without an eating disorder can relate with is the process of self-evaluation that we all undergo. The problem is that most of these self-evaluation processes aren't done with the intention of getting better most of the time. What I do think we do in these scenarios is actually trying to see ourselves through the eyes of others. But that's a trap, because that's not called self-critiquing yourself, that's called critiquing yourself, period. And I do recognize that the difference between critiquing and self-critiquing is very subtle, but there is. Imagine the scenario in which you wake up in the morning and you did not have the chance to mirror yourself on any surface, whether it be your window, your phone, an actual mirror, anything. You go on about your day, usual routine, with the only difference that you do not have the chance to mirror yourself on any surface. What would your reaction be? In most cases, most people would actually panic even more. See, that is critiquing yourself, because the need of looking at yourself arises from only one concern and one concern only, and that is looking presentable to other people's eyes, being accepted. But what if you woke up the next day and the thought of having to mirror yourself, of having to check up on yourself visually, doesn't occur at all? You go on about your day, again, usual routine, you get out of your door, and no one notices you. No one looks at you, no one comments on how you look, nothing. You're a complete ghost. How would that feel? The next day, would you still want to look at yourself, despite knowing that no one is gonna even look at you and notice you in the first place? If your answer is yes, in this case, that's what I call self-critiquing, because I believe that the need of looking at yourself arises from a concern that comes from your heart, in which you want to look good for yourself, for your own well-being, and not for somebody else. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't shower anymore or we shouldn't do makeup anymore because what really matters is our own self-perception and our beauty? No. Looking beautiful for others is also part of our culture, and it does make us feel better of who we are, because we also do receive good comments and not only bad comments of how we look. But at the same time, I believe that we can do both. I think it has to start from a self-critique and then become a critique. If I begin with self-critique, if I begin by taking care of the way I look for myself, therefore I feel good, then I can critique also myself through a different type of perspective, saying, people might also like what I'm doing. I'm doing this because I like it, and therefore people might also appreciate it. So moral of the story is, I believe that the moment that social anxiety barrier, if you will, is broken down, in which, you don't care about other people's judgment and all that jazz, is the actual moment where you start looking at yourself for who you are without over-exaggerating also your persona. The simple truth. That's all. Now, for some of us, looking at ourselves for who we really are isn't that easy. And I speak for myself here. Most of the times, we think it's easier to assume facts about ourselves based on other people's perception of us, because we know that the hardcore truth might be slightly more triggering. Again, speaking for myself. So what basically happens is we decide to go with what people see or think of us. For example, in the past, and still to this day, sometimes I catch myself doing this, I would tend to ask people if they thought I was overweight. And most of the times, if not almost always, they would say, "No, your arms are so skinny. What are you talking about?" But I knew they would say that because I would wear these very wide t-shirts that would cover like 98% of my body. And regardless of that, I chose to go with their version, their perception of who I was, even though I had more valid information. I chose to believe a version of me that wasn't accurate. But the moment we take this example and we reverse it, the outline changes a little. I came back from the US to Italy. I do this every summer, and I stay here for about a couple of months. And usually what I do is I go and check up on the people I haven't seen for over a year. And most of the people I've met this year would tell me how I've gotten bigger in comparison to last year. And in this scenario, I have two options. Option number one, I don't listen to them because they don't know where I'm coming from. They haven't seen me from an entire year. Spoiler, that is not the route I went with. Option number two is decide to take their word, even though I knew that I actually did some improvement 4 months before going back to Italy. They just didn't see it. Obviously, the route I went with. Now, see what's happening here? In both outlines, I chose to listen to the version of myself that wasn't complete, wasn't accurate. And depending on the case, my mental response was very different. In the first case, I wanted to believe that I was actually skinny, even though I wasn't. But in the second case, I chose to believe that my weight was completely out of control, even though I was working on it 4 months prior to coming back to Italy. They just didn't know it. So what I learned from this is that I constantly need to remind myself that nobody knows me as well as I do. But then the question that comes up is, how do we learn to look at ourselves for who we really are, the hardcore truth, and learn to not listen to the negative comments in other people? One thing that we should always keep in mind is that most of the times the people who call out on us for the way we look, we eat, we walk, they are suffering from something similar. The only thing is that they're projecting their discomfort, their fears, through not the most sane way. And this is where I think that people have three main reactions to their discomfort. Number one is they bottle it down. They keep it inside until eventually it explodes out of them. Number two is they get mad. They're angry. And that's where, the negative comments, the bullying comes out. You know the drill. Number three is they ask for help. Unfortunately, that's the most uncommon one. As I've also said in the previous episode, asking for help is actually a sign of strength. And I think that in all three cases I just mentioned, so the bottling it down, the anger, and the actual asking for help, can all be summed into one solution, and that is realizing that you need to ask for help and then asking for help. Because the moment you realize that you need help is the moment you're gonna accept other people's input. Just as a reminder, it is important to remember that most of the times, the people who call you out for the way you look, whether it be a person that you know that is close to you or a person that is a complete stranger, it has nothing to do with you. And most likely with their fears and their insecurities. And I say most likely because there are some people out there who do genuinely care about us. And as much as that might be hard for us, we need to learn to decipher whether someone has good or bad intentions. Because we might fall into a very severe trap the moment we start not listening to others. What happens is we build a certain type of attitude, which to us might look like a simple safety mechanism, a precaution, if you will, in which we learn to, ignore the bad comments and underestimate the people who don't have our best interest. But on the other hand, that will most certainly look like we are building a wall between the people who care about us and ourselves. So the question you might ask is, how do we learn to let people in the first place? And how do we learn to decipher whether these people are having good intentions or really bad intentions? And that is through self-acceptance. I've learned this not too long ago, and I'm still working on it because it's a lifelong journey. It never ends. It never stops. But it does get better. Bear with me. Accepting yourself doesn't mean convincing yourself that the way you look now is going to be like this forever and that you just have to get on with it. The complete opposite. What accepting yourself really means is understanding your limits in that specific chapter of your life and then taking it from there. And what that does is it puts you on this path of self-growth and also of a lot of failure, mental failure, because it requires for you to be humble, and being humble is very difficult because it means you have to let your guard down. You need to ask for help. Keep in mind, by asking help, I don't necessarily mean asking help to a third party, to somebody else, but even just listening to yourself more. Because most of the times, we don't realize this, but most of the times, we give ourselves some red lights. We give ourselves some flags that actually lead the way to a better solution. We just have to learn to listen to ourselves. The easiest example I can give you is the runway of a plane. At night, most of the time, pilots can't see where to land if it weren't for those lights that actually told them this is where you have to land. That is exactly what we have to do. We have to learn to look for those lights in our darkness. And that requires for us to be humble, humility. But remember that no one else other than you knows the real reason to your struggle. In this case with food and therefore your body, your weight. But only once you've started to actually do some self-digging, once you've understood your situation, once you've accepted yourself. So to put theory into practice, what happens is the moment you're being critiqued, you are going to feel slightly more comfortable. And the moment you're going to build that less toxic self-defense system I mentioned previously, is going to be a situation in which you're not going to be cutting off the people who care about you, but you're going to naturally just not going to listen to the people who just have the worst intentions. Now, I'm not saying you have to accept that situation, because being disrespected isn't a situation that has to be accepted. It's a situation that has to be dealt with. But that's the moment when you can start building that safety mechanism I mentioned before without it having the toxic traits, though. In this scenario, you're going to have the opportunity to actually let in the people who care about you and let out the people who have the worst interest in you. And that's the moment in which I believe you can start really looking at yourself for who you really are through your own eyes. Do I like what I see? Does that make me feel comfortable with what I see? Regardless of the nowadays perception of beauty, you should try to keep that tunnel vision. Keep your eyes on the prize. Because guess what? Not everyone will think that you're attractive. Not everyone will like you. Not everyone is going to come up to you and say, hey, I really like your makeup today. Sometimes not even the people that are closest to us. I want to give you a last example. And I'm not giving this example because I want to throw shade on someone, but simply because I believe it will help someone out there. During my, again, teen years, I would eat lunch, breakfast, dinner with my family, right? We would be on the table. It would be my father, me, and my mother. And most of the times, my dad would keep a very, very close eye to what I put on my plate. He would always make it very obvious at the same time, like that bombastic side eye. And the moment he thought I would exaggerate on something, the extra cookie or the extra loaf of bread, he would actually take that item and move it to the opposite side of the table, saying, enough. And then he would point out, you've been eating too much, you're overweight. And what that does is, even though it might come from a good place in your heart, it really makes you feel so little, so in a way disgusting. And what I have to say about this is there will always be people, especially sometimes people close to you, that will treat you like that. And it is your job to take care of yourself. We spoke about this also on the previous episode. Taking care of yourself. And that also means protecting yourself from other people's actions. Sometimes it's just by ignoring them. So going back to the eating situation, the relationship with food, we should try to do the same thing. We need to learn to see the relationship that we have with our food through a very clear lens and not through somebody else's perception. Because what I put on my plate on that particular meal is my business and my business only. So yeah, this is the relationship between me and food.